Does time travel really exist? If they've already happened, how can we prove it? And what happened to people who have traveled through time? Today, we'll try to find this out together. This is Infinity. And in this episode, I'll share 10 people teleportation stories. Let's go. In 1932, a journalist named J. Bernard Hutton and a photographer, Joachim Brandt, went to a shipyard in Hamburg on assignment from newspaper editors. Upon returning to the publishing house, the couple stated that almost immediately after their arrival at the shipyard, bombs began falling from the sky. Of course, they had to seek shelter, but immediately after the bombing, they got out and took a series of pictures of the ruins of the waterfront. Needless to say that no one at the publishing house believed them. There'd been no bombing in Hamburg that day. Confident that they were right, Hutton and Brandt rushed to develop the photos, and they were disappointed. The pictures did indeed show the same waterfront, but there were no signs of any destruction. It would be possible to put this case aside and recognize it as just another tall tale, if not for the fate of the journalists. 10 years after the bizarre insanity, Hutton, who had moved to London, opened the morning paper and read with amazement about the bombing of a shipyard in Hamburg. The newspapers reported that the brutal attack was part of an operation called Gomorrah. But most strikingly of all is that the pictures in the London paper were not much different from those taken by Hutton and Brandt 10 years earlier. A traveler to World War II. In 2016, the Icelandic media unexpectedly published a picture supposedly taken in Reykjavik in 1943 at the height of World War II. In the foreground, we see a group of American privates, several sailors, and passers-by in gray cloaks. But who is this man leaning against a store window? He's clearly on the phone. But how's that possible? After all, in the middle of the last century, wireless means of communication were out of the question. The photo was posted on social media by a man named Christian Hoffman. In just a few days, it gained popularity and began to generate more and more waves of controversy. The photo's been checked many times for editing and retouching, but no signs of faking have been found. Can this photo be considered proof of time travel? Or at least a proof that cell phones were invented much earlier than we think? It's up to you to decide. The Moberly-Jourdain incident. In 1901, two British teachers, Charlotte Ann Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, went on a tour of legendary Palace of Versailles. The admiration for art went according to plan until the girls reached the Petit Trianon, a small chateau on the grounds of Versailles. As soon as the couple approached the building, it was as if the world around them changed. Now the teachers saw people dressed in costumes from the 18th century. Many of the buildings that now surrounded them had not been around for a couple of centuries. One of the girls even declared that she had managed to see the ghost of Marie Antoinette herself. In 1911, Moberly and Jourdain even published a book about their unique experience, calling it An Adventure. Skeptics, of course, didn't spare the girls. Most thought that the couple were the victim of a group hallucination or simply stumbled into a costume party. Fact remains that many still believe that Moberly and Jourdain managed to travel through time and return back safely. If you think that curiosities like the story of the two teachers could only be taken seriously in 1901, you're wrong. Those with more recent time jumps tell their stories just as convincingly. They even have proof. Stay tuned to find out all the details. Let's move on. Flower Festival. In 1993, Alf and Eileen Roberts went for a weekend in the English country of Somerset. They didn't have much time, and after a day of walking around the area, the couple got into the car and drove back to the hotel. At 7:30, they realized they were lost. If the signs were to be believed, the nearest settlement to them was a village called Bampton. The couple decided that there must be a straight road between the two villages and decided to drive through the village. Bampton turned out to be very nice. The residents clearly weren't trying to keep up with everything. They hadn't even removed the wooden sign at the entrance to the village that welcomed guests to the 1976 Flower Festival. Flowers were clearly very popular here. The streets were still littered with pots and vases of brightly colored plants. The Roberts returned safely to a hotel in nearby Dunstan, but the flower village made such an impression on them that they decided to return the next day. Imagine their surprise when on the second visit to Bampton, they found not a single flower in the streets. And the village itself had changed greatly. But how could this have happened in just one day? The couple were at a loss to understand what had happened. They were prompted by the wristwatch, which stopped yesterday showing the same time, 7 hours and 30 minutes. Rudolph Fetz. In June 1950, a tragic event occurred in Times Square. A man named Rudolph Fetz was hit by a car. The deceased was dressed very strangely, as if he was on his way to a historical festival. The police began to investigate, and suddenly it turned out that a man named Rudolph Fetz was reported missing. Interestingly, he was reported missing back in 1876. In the pockets of the man's old-fashioned cloak were found a beer flask, a horse and wagon care bill, a letter dated 1876, $70, and business cards. All these things looked like new, which led police officers to assume that before them lay the body of a time traveler who had gone from 1876 straight to 1950. In November 1956, an unknown man was run over. The driver and witnesses claimed that he jumped out onto the road quite unexpectedly, as if he had appeared out of thin air. The accident ended tragically. The police had to identify the man based on the contents of his pockets. In his pockets, they found his ID card and business cards, on which was written where he lived and that he worked as a traveling salesman. However, all the dates on the cards were from the previous century. The police even had to interview distant relatives and people who lived nearby. Among them was an old lady who claimed that her father disappeared about 60 years ago under unknown circumstances. He went for a walk on Broadway and never returned. A few minutes into the future. Another strange story took place in 2004 in the U.S. state of Missouri. A young man named Jake decided to shoot a strange phenomenon in the sky. In the footage taken from his front porch, the glow resembled an aurora. Suddenly, a bright line of white light streaked the sky from west to east, and Jake couldn't even move. He stood there in panic for a few minutes, but his ability to move returned as suddenly as it had disappeared. The frightened boy returned to the house where he told his parents what had happened to him. His parents noticed strange scratches on the boy's face and assured him that he had not been in the house for at least an hour. The strangest thing about this story was that after returning from the porch, Jake found himself certain that it was 2008 and the U.S. had a very different president. The Victor Goddard Flight. In 1935, RAF Air Marshal Victor Goddard flew to Edinburgh. Halfway there, the pilot decided to land for refueling at an old and abandoned military airfield in Drem. Before he could land, however, Goddard was caught in a strange storm consisting of dense yellow clouds. When the clouds cleared and the landing strip reappeared below, it was quite different. The airfield was completely cleared with yellow planes on the runway and mechanics in blue jackets bustling around them. Victor was only a dozen meters above the ground, but none of the mechanics saw him or even heard the approaching aircraft, as if he was invisible to the people on the ground. Surprised by this sudden change, Goddard decided to fly on without landing. Upon arriving home, Victor told some of his colleagues and friends about his experience, but he was met with nothing but skepticism. Afraid of being ridiculed and putting his career at risk, he kept quiet about his adventure for several years. It wasn't until 4 years later that he finally realized what he had seen in Drem after the yellow storm. Goddard found out that in 1939, training planes had been painted yellow and mechanics had changed from brown uniform to blue. The alley between the past and the future. Britain turned out to be rich in time travelers. In the 21st century, Liverpool was especially distinguished. Several curious events happened there at once, as if a portal opened in the center of the old city, teleporting people. In 2006, 19-year-old Sean was caught shoplifting, so he decided to get away from security. Fleeing the chase, Sean crossed Hanover Street and ducked into one of the alleys, but suddenly felt a strange pain in his chest. Breathing became difficult. The guy panicked, looking around for police and guards, but no one was chasing him. But as soon as he looked out of the alley, he was even more frightened. There were no more high-rise buildings on the streets. Vintage cars drove by and people in cloaks passed by. Confused, Sean made his way to a newsstand and picked up the first newspaper he saw. The headline announced May 18, 1967. What to do now? Sean decided to go back to the alley, hoping to go through the portal again. It worked. In just a few minutes, he was back in his own time. That's all, guys. Do you believe that time travel is possible? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching and see you later.